The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Morton's grocery store as Marcus Johnson pushed his shopping cart down the cereal aisle. At 35, Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence, his dark brown eyes warm and observant as they scanned the shelves. As the owner of a successful local restaurant, Sweet Home Cooking, he usually did his shopping during these quieter hours when the after-work rush hadn't yet begun. Today, however, was different. The store was unusually crowded, perhaps because of the upcoming weekend sales. As Marcus reached for a box of whole grain cereal, he heard the distinct sound of coins clinking together, followed by frustrated sighs from somewhere near the checkout counters. Looking up from his shopping, Marcus noticed several customers in line wearing expressions of poorly concealed annoyance. Their eyes were fixed on an elderly man at the front of the checkout line. The man wore a faded military veteran cap, its blue fabric showing years of wear, with Vietnam veteran embroidered in gold threading that had begun to unravel at the edges. The veteran's hands trembled slightly as he dug through his pockets, pulling out handfuls of coins and carefully counting them on the counter. His weathered face showed deep worry lines as he separated quarters from dimes and nickels. The total on the register display read $78.45, and from what Marcus could see, the small piles of coins wouldn't come close to covering it. "Sir, perhaps you can step aside and let others go through while you count," the young cashier suggested nervously, glancing at the growing line behind him. The veteran's shoulders slumped at her words, and his movements became more frantic as he searched his other pockets. Marcus found himself moving closer, abandoning his own shopping cart near the magazine rack. He could now see the items on the conveyor belt more clearly: generic bread, milk, several cans of soup, some fruits and vegetables that weren't in the best condition but were marked down for quick sale, and what appeared to be prescription medication boxes. The veteran pulled out a worn leather wallet, his fingers fumbling with a plastic payment card. "I'm sorry, I know I have enough in my account," he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. The cashier ran the card through the machine, but the declined transaction sound echoed loudly in the now quiet checkout area. A few customers behind him began to shuffle impatiently, while others avoided looking directly at the scene unfolding before them. I'll put some things back," the veteran said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. As he reached for the bread and milk first, the most expensive items, Marcus noticed something that made his heart clench. The veteran's hands were shaking not just from age, but from what appeared to be suppressed emotion. The old-timer began sorting his groceries into two piles, essential medication in one and food in another, clearly preparing to leave the food behind. His movements were deliberate, but heavy with resignation, like a man who had grown too familiar with making such choices. Behind him, a woman in business attire checked her watch dramatically, while another customer muttered something about holding up the whole line. Marcus noticed how the veteran's shoulders curved inward with each comment, making his already thin frame appear even smaller. In that moment, Marcus remembered his own grandfather, also a veteran, who had passed away 5 years ago. He had taught Marcus that true character wasn't about what you did when everyone was watching, but about the choices you made when helping others brought no recognition or reward. Without hesitation, Marcus stepped forward, his voice clear and kind as he addressed both the cashier and the veteran. "Excuse me," he said, moving closer to the counter. The veteran looked up, his blue eyes clouded with a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. The fluorescent store lights highlighted the deep creases in his face, telling stories of both hardship and dignity. Marcus could see the veteran's name, James Cooper, printed on an old military ID card that lay among the scattered coins. Mr. Cooper stood very straight despite his evident distress, maintaining the bearing of a man who had once served his country proudly. In the brief moment before Marcus spoke again, he noticed small details about Mr. Cooper: the carefully polished shoes despite their worn condition, the neatly pressed though faded shirt, and the way he had meticulously arranged his groceries to make them easier for the cashier to scan. These were the habits of a man who took pride in doing things properly, even when life had made things difficult. The entire scene had unfolded in less than 10 minutes, but for Marcus Johnson, it was a moment that would change multiple lives forever. "Please stop putting those items back," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll take care of your groceries, sir." The words hung in the air as other customers stopped their muttering, suddenly paying attention to this unexpected turn of events. James Cooper froze, a can of soup still in his trembling hand. His weathered face showed a complex mix of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, and something that looked like wounded pride. "Young man, I can't accept that," he said softly, though his voice carried the unmistakable strength of someone used to standing his ground. "It's too much to ask of a stranger." The cashier, whose name tag read Jenny, stood quietly, her earlier nervousness replaced by careful attention to the scene unfolding before her. The total amount still glowed on the register: $78.45. To some, it might not seem like much, but the way Mr. Cooper had been counting coins suggested it represented far more than just a grocery bill to him. Marcus moved closer, speaking quietly so only Mr. Cooper could hear him. "Sir, my grandfather was a veteran too. He taught me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help when we need it." As he spoke, Marcus noticed the slight tremor in Mr. Cooper's hands had gotten worse, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the store's cool air conditioning. The older man's shoulders sagged slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition of a kindness he couldn't refuse. "I never thought I'd be in this position," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "My Sarah, my wife, she always handled the finances. After she..." He paused, swallowing hard. "After the medical bills, there wasn't much left." As Marcus pulled out his credit card, Mr. Cooper slowly began explaining, as if he needed to justify accepting the help. "The pension check doesn't come until next week, and my prescriptions couldn't wait. I thought I had enough in the account, but the last insurance payment must have gone through early." The other customers in line had grown quiet, their earlier impatience replaced by reflection. A few looked down at their own carts, perhaps reconsidering their recent irritation. Jenny, the cashier, began scanning the items again, handling each one with extra care as if to make up for her earlier suggestion that Mr. Cooper step aside. While the transaction was being processed, Marcus noticed more details about Mr. Cooper's intended purchases. Among the basic items were dog food and a small toy, evidence of a loyal companion at home, and a birthday card that had been placed at the bottom of the pile, likely intended for someone special but deemed non-essential when the money ran short. "My card should work now," Marcus said warmly, handing it to Jenny. As she processed the payment, Mr. Cooper's eyes filled with tears he struggled to hold back. His military bearing was still evident in how straight he stood, even as his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. "I'll pay you back," Mr. Cooper insisted, reaching for the small notebook in his shirt pocket, probably to write down Marcus's information. "As soon as my check comes in." Marcus shook his head gently. "There's no need for that, sir. Instead, maybe you could tell me about your service sometime? I'd like to hear your stories." The suggestion seemed to help Mr. Cooper regain his composure, offering him a way to give something in return that didn't involve money. As Jenny handed over the receipt, she had already begun bagging the groceries with extra care, making sure the bread wouldn't get crushed and the eggs were secure. Other customers, now moved by the scene, stepped forward to help bag the items, their earlier frustration transformed into compassion. Mr. Cooper looked at the bags, then at Marcus, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "Young man," he began, his voice steadier now, "you remind me of the men I served with. Always looking out for each other, no questions asked." He reached out to shake Marcus's hand, and Marcus noticed the strength still present in his grip. As they finished gathering the bags, Mr. Cooper pulled something from his wallet, an old, creased photograph. "This was my unit in '69, he said, his voice catching slightly. "We took care of each other, just like you're doing now. Never thought I'd be on this end of things, though." The moment was interrupted by the soft ding of the register as the next customer's items were being scanned, bringing them both back to the present. Yet something significant had changed in that grocery store checkout line, not just for Marcus and Mr. Cooper, but for everyone who witnessed this unexpected act of kindness. The late afternoon sunlight had shifted as Marcus and Mr. Cooper made their way to the parking lot of Morton's grocery store. Marcus insisted on helping with the bags, noting how Mr. Cooper moved carefully, favoring his right leg slightly as they walked. The grocery store's automatic doors whooshed shut behind them, leaving the fluorescent lights and curious onlookers behind. "My car's just over there," Mr. Cooper said, pointing to an aging blue Chevrolet sedan parked in the far corner of the lot. The car, like its owner, showed signs of better days, The paint was fading, and small spots of rust dotted the wheel wells, but it was clean and clearly well maintained despite its age. As they approached the vehicle, a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the store's landscaping. Mr. Cooper fumbled with his keys, and Marcus noticed they were attached to a worn Marine Corps keychain, its emblem barely visible after years of handling. Sarah picked this spot, Mr. Cooper suddenly said, his voice soft with memory. She always said parking far from the store entrance gave us a chance to walk together. He paused, running his hand along the car's roof. We've been coming here every Thursday for 20 years. Marcus set the grocery bags down carefully as Mr. Cooper unlocked the trunk. Inside, Marcus spotted a neatly folded blanket and an emergency kit, signs of someone who believed in being prepared. A small dog bed occupied one corner, explaining the dog food in their purchases. Rex is waiting at home, Mr. Cooper explained, noticing Marcus's glance at the bed. He's all I've got now, since Sarah. His voice trailed off, and he busied himself with arranging the grocery bags in the trunk, making sure none would tip over during the drive home. The mention of Sarah seemed to open a floodgate of emotions for Mr. Cooper. As he stood there, one hand still resting on a grocery bag, he began to speak. 47 years we were married. She fought the cancer for 3 years, never complained once. But the treatments, he shook his head slowly. They took everything we had saved. Marcus listened quietly, understanding that Mr. Cooper needed to share this burden that he'd been carrying alone. The older man continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about his wife. She was a teacher, you know. 3rd grade, the kids loved her. Even after she retired, former students would stop her in this very parking lot to say hello. A car horn humped somewhere in the distance, and Mr. Cooper seemed to remember where they were. He straightened his shoulders, military training showing through once again. I'm sorry, son. Didn't mean to talk your ear off about my troubles. Please don't apologize, Marcus replied, helping to arrange the last few bags. Sometimes sharing our stories is as important as sharing our bread. The words had come from his grandmother, who'd always believed in the healing power of both food and conversation. Mr. Cooper nodded, then reached into one of the bags and pulled out the birthday card Marcus had noticed earlier. It's for my daughter, he said, turning the simple card over in his hands. Sarah always remembered everyone's birthdays. I'm trying to keep that going, even though... He didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood, even though everything else had fallen apart. As they finished loading the groceries, Mr. Cooper pulled out his worn leather wallet once again. At least let me give you my phone number, he insisted, in case you ever need a veteran's perspective on things. His hands were steadier now as he wrote his number on a small scrap of paper. Marcus accepted the paper, noting the precise, careful handwriting. He then took out one of his own business cards, simple white cardstock with "Sweet Home Cooking" printed in warm brown letters. This is my restaurant, he explained. Please call if you need anything. Anything at all. Mr. Cooper studied the card carefully before tucking it into his shirt pocket, right next to the small notebook he tried to use earlier to record his debt. Sweet Home Cooking, he repeated softly. Sarah would have liked that name. She always said good food was like a warm hug for the soul. As Mr. Cooper prepared to leave, he turned to Marcus one last time. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, but his eyes were clear and bright. Young man, he said, his voice firm, you've done more than just help with groceries today. You've reminded an old soldier that there's still good in this world. Marcus watched as Mr. Cooper carefully backed out of the parking space, the old Chevrolet's engine rumbling to life with a sound that spoke of regular maintenance despite limited means. As the car disappeared around the corner, Marcus knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. 3 days after their first meeting at the grocery store, Marcus pulled his car into the quiet suburban neighborhood where Mr. Cooper lived. The address, scribbled on the back of the paper with Mr. Cooper's phone number, led him to a modest single-story house with a well-maintained front yard. Despite its small size, the garden showed signs of loving care. Roses bloomed along the walkway, and neat rows of vegetables grew in raised beds. As Marcus walked up the path, he carried a container of homemade beef stew from his restaurant. He'd called the day before, wanting to check on the veteran, and had noticed the slight hesitation in Mr. Cooper's voice when asked about dinner plans. Before Marcus could reach the door, excited barking erupted from inside the house. Just a minute, Mr. Cooper's voice called out, followed by the sound of paws scrambling on hardwood floors. When the door opened, Marcus found himself face to face with Rex, an elderly golden retriever whose tail wagged with enough force to shake his entire body. "Down, Rex," Mr. Cooper commanded gently, though his smile showed he wasn't truly bothered by the dog's enthusiasm. He looked more relaxed than he had at the store, wearing a faded Marine Corps t-shirt and well-worn jeans. "Come in, son. Don't mind Rex. He's forgotten his manners since Sarah passed. She was the strict one." The inside of the house told its own story. Everything was neat and clean, but there were subtle signs of Sarah's absence: a collection of unopened mail on the coffee table, a layer of dust on the piano in the corner, and a single chair at the kitchen table instead of two. Family photos lined the walls, chronicling decades of happy moments frozen in time. "Something smells wonderful," Mr. Cooper said, eyeing the container in Marcus's hands. His kitchen showed signs of limited use. A few dishes in the drying rack, mostly coffee cups and simple plates. The refrigerator held several frozen TV dinners, visible when he opened it to store Marcus's container. As Mr. Cooper made coffee, he began sharing more about his life. He'd been a Marine Corps sergeant, serving 2 tours in Vietnam. After the war, he worked as a high school custodian for 30 years, while Sarah taught 3rd grade at the same school. "We drove to work together every day," he recalled, his voice warm with memory. "Even after all those years, we never ran out of things to talk about." Rex settled at Marcus's feet as they sat in the living room, the old dog seeming to sense a kindred spirit. Mr. Cooper picked up a photo album from the bookshelf, its corners worn from frequent handling. "Sarah kept everything," he explained, opening to a page showing a much younger version of himself in uniform. As they looked through the album, Marcus noticed a recurring theme. Many photos showed family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and what appeared to be birthday parties for a young girl. But the more recent pages were notably empty of such images. "That's Sarah Jr.," Mr. Cooper said quietly, pointing to a photo of a smiling teenager. "We call her Sarah J. She's out in California now, has been for years." His voice carried a weight that suggested there was more to the story, but he didn't elaborate. The afternoon light began to fade as they talked, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Marcus noticed Mr. Cooper moving stiffly as he got up to turn on a lamp, his right leg clearly giving him trouble. Without being asked, Marcus stood up and helped adjust the throw pillows on the couch to make him more comfortable. "You remind me of her, you know," Mr. Cooper said suddenly. "Sarah, I mean. She could always tell when someone needed help, even before they knew it themselves." He paused, looking at a picture of his late wife on the wall. "She would have liked you." Before leaving, Marcus helped Mr. Cooper heat up some of the beef stew for dinner. The kitchen came alive with the warmth of good food and conversation, feeling less empty than it had when they first arrived. Rex watched hopefully from his spot near the table, his brown eyes fixed on the bowl. "Next time, bring your appetite," Mr. Cooper said as he walked Marcus to the door. "I may not cook much anymore, but I still remember how to grill a decent burger. Sarah made me promise to keep the old Weber grill running." As Marcus drove home that evening, he thought about the soldier who'd become a school custodian, the love story that spanned nearly 5 decades, and the mysterious absence of Sarah J. He realized that his simple act of kindness at the grocery store had opened the door to a story that was still unfolding, with chapters yet to be written. Over the next few weeks, Marcus's visits to Mr. Cooper's house became a regular occurrence. Every Wednesday evening, after closing his restaurant for the afternoon break, he would arrive with food and find himself immersed in conversations that revealed more pieces of the Cooper family puzzle. On this particular Wednesday, Marcus noticed something different as he pulled into the driveway. The garage door was open, revealing decades of accumulated memories scattered across the concrete floor. Mr. Cooper stood among boxes and old furniture, his hands resting on what appeared to be a child's bicycle. "Sarah J's first bike," Mr. Cooper explained as Marcus approached, running his hand along the faded pink handlebars. "I taught her to ride right here in this driveway. Spent a whole weekend running alongside her, catching her when she wobbled." His voice carried both pride and pain, emotions that seemed to surface whenever he mentioned his daughter. Rex lay in the garage doorway, his gray muzzle resting on his paws as he watched them. The old dog had grown noticeably more energetic since Marcus's visits began, as if the presence of a new friend had sparked something in him too. I've been meaning to sort through all this, Mr. Cooper continued, gesturing at the boxes. Sarah, my wife, she kept everything. Every drawing Sarah J. made, every report card, every letter. He picked up a shoebox filled with envelopes, their edges yellowed with age. Marcus set down the container of chicken pot pie he'd brought and joined Mr. Cooper in the garage. As they began going through boxes, the story of Sarah J. slowly emerged. Report cards showed she'd been an excellent student, following in her mother's footsteps with a love for literature and art. Photographs captured her growth from a pigtailed little girl to a confident teenager. She was accepted to 5 colleges, Mr. Cooper said, holding up an acceptance letter from UCLA. Full scholarship to study art. We were so proud. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully refolded the letter. That's when everything changed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows in the garage as Mr. Cooper revealed the story he'd been holding back. Sarah G. had fallen in love during her sophomore year of college with a young man who wanted to be a filmmaker. Against her parents' advice, she had dropped out of college to follow him to Los Angeles, convinced they would make it big in Hollywood. We'd argued, Mr. Cooper admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I said things a father shouldn't say to his daughter. Told her she was throwing her life away. He picked up a frame containing Sarah J.'s high school graduation photo. She left the next day. That was 12 years ago. Marcus listened as Mr. Cooper described the years of minimal contact that followed. Christmas cards with no return address, occasional phone calls that grew shorter and less frequent. The young man had eventually left, leaving Sarah J. alone in a city where she knew no one. Sarah, my wife, she never gave up trying to reach her, Mr. Cooper said, opening another box. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to various locations in Los Angeles, many marked "Return to Sender." She wrote every week, even when we didn't know where to send them. As they worked, Marcus noticed a pattern in the letters. The most recent ones, written in Mrs. Cooper's increasingly shaky handwriting, had taken on a desperate tone. She had known her time was running short and wanted to reunite her family before it was too late. The last letter came back the day after the funeral, Mr. Cooper said quietly, holding up an envelope with a final "Return to Sender" stamp. Sarah J. never knew her mother was sick. I didn't know how to reach her, how to tell her. Rex had moved closer, sensing his master's distress, and rested his head on Mr. Cooper's knee. Marcus watched as the proud Marine wiped tears from his eyes, no longer trying to hide his pain. I failed them both, Mr. Cooper whispered. My wife and my daughter. Sarah begged me to try harder to find Sarah J., but I was too stubborn, too hurt by what had happened. He looked at Marcus, his blue eyes clouded with regret. Now it's too late. Marcus picked up one of the returned letters, noting the various addresses and forwarding attempts. In that moment, as he looked at Mr. Cooper surrounded by the physical remnants of his family's history, an idea began to form. Perhaps it wasn't too late after all. As the evening sun cast its final rays into the garage, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would find Sarah J., not just for Mr. Cooper's sake, but for the memory of a mother who never stopped trying to bring her family back together. The next morning, Marcus sat in his restaurant office before opening hours, surrounded by papers from Mr. Cooper's garage. He had borrowed several of the returned letters and photos with the promise to handle them carefully. His laptop screen glowed with various social media search results for Sarah Cooper and Sarah J. Cooper in the Los Angeles area. Finding someone in a city of millions proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. He scrolled through dozens of profiles, comparing faces to the graduation photo he propped against his coffee mug. None of them matched the young woman with her father's blue eyes and her mother's gentle smile. As he worked through his regular day at the restaurant, Marcus's mind kept returning to the search. During a quiet moment between lunch and dinner service, he noticed one of his regular customers, Detective Mike Rodriguez, sitting at his usual corner table. Mike, Marcus called out, approaching the table with fresh coffee. Can I ask you something? The detective looked up from his crossword puzzle, nodding. Marcus explained the situation, careful to respect Mr. Cooper's privacy while sharing the essential details. There's a website that helps locate people, Mike said, writing down a web address. It's what we use sometimes for missing persons cases. Not cheap, but pretty reliable. He paused, then added, for a Vietnam vet, I'll make some calls. Over the next few days, Marcus devoted every spare moment to the search. He discovered that Sarah G. had indeed pursued an art career, finding her name credited in several small gallery shows from years ago. Each lead felt like another piece of the puzzle, bringing him closer to finding her. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A small coffee shop's Instagram post featured local artists, and there in the background of one photo, Marcus spotted a familiar face. Sarah J. looked remarkably like her mother now, her dark hair streaked with early gray, but her father's determined expression was unmistakable. The coffee shop's owner, when contacted, remembered Sarah J. well. She does our chopboard art, she explained over the phone. Beautiful work. She's been coming here for years, ever since that whole mess with her ex-boyfriend and the failed movie project. Marcus's heart raced as he jotted down the details. Sarah G. came to the coffee shop every Sunday morning, the owner said, to update their weekly specials board. She lived nearby, having finally found success as a commercial artist designing logos and storefront displays for local businesses. With trembling fingers, Marcus dialed the number Mike had tracked down. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello. Is this Sarah J. Cooper?" Marcus asked, his throat tight with anticipation. The line went quiet for a moment. "Nobody's called me that in years," she finally responded. "Who is this?" Marcus took a deep breath and explained who he was and how he'd met her father. He described the garage full of memories, the returned letters, and most importantly, the love and regret that filled Mr. Cooper's voice whenever he spoke of his daughter. "Dad kept everything?" Sarah G's voice cracked slightly. I thought they would have thrown it all away after what I did." "Your mother never gave up trying to find you," Marcus said gently. "And your father. Sarah, he needs to tell you about your mom." The silence that followed felt endless. When Sarah J. spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "What about Mom? Is she okay?" Marcus closed his eyes, knowing the next words would change everything. "Sarah, your mother passed away 8 months ago. Cancer. She tried to find you. Your father tried too, but they couldn't reach you in time." The sound of muffled sobbing came through the phone. "I changed my number. Moved around so much." Sarah G. managed between tears. "I was too ashamed to call. Every year, I'd think about coming home, but I kept putting it off, thinking there would be time." "There's still time," Marcus said softly. "Not for your mother, but for your father. He's not doing well, Sarah. He needs you." Through her tears, Sarah G. began asking questions about her father, about Rex, about the house she'd grown up in. Marcus answered each one, carefully building a bridge across 12 years of silence. As their conversation drew to a close, Sarah Jane made a decision that would change multiple lives. "I can be there this weekend," she said firmly. "But could you help me? I'm not sure I can face this alone." Marcus smiled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift slightly. "I have an idea," he said, already planning how to make this reunion something special. "Let me make some arrangements at my restaurant." The evening light cast a warm glow through the windows of Sweet Home Cooking as Marcus made final preparations for the reunion. He had closed the restaurant early, telling his staff only that he was hosting a special private dinner. The tables had been rearranged to create an intimate setting in the corner, with soft lighting and fresh flowers creating a welcoming atmosphere. Mr. Cooper believed he was coming for their usual Wednesday dinner, just at the restaurant instead of his home. Marcus had suggested the change casually, mentioning that he needed to check on some evening deliveries. The old veteran had agreed, though he insisted on bringing Rex, not wanting to leave his faithful companion alone. At 6:30, Marcus heard a tentative knock on the restaurant's side door. Sarah J. stood there, looking both older and younger than her photos. Her face showed the wear of difficult years, but her eyes held the same bright spirit he'd seen in her childhood pictures. Behind her stood 2 children, a boy around 10 and a girl who couldn't be more than 8. "These are my kids," Sarah J. explained nervously, her hands resting protectively on their shoulders. "Tommy and Marie. I named her after Mom." The little girl smiled shyly, revealing dimples identical to those Marcus had seen in Mrs. Cooper's photos. Marcus led them to a private room he'd set up adjacent to the main dining area. "Your father doesn't know you're here," he explained gently. "I thought it might be easier this way, giving you a moment to prepare." Sarah J. nodded gratefully, kneeling down to straighten her children's clothes with trembling hands. At precisely 7 o'clock, the bell above the restaurant door chimed. Marcus heard Rex's familiar happy panting, followed by Mr. Cooper's voice greeting the hostess. Marcus said to come right in, he was saying, though I feel a bit underdressed for such a nice place. Sarah J. froze at the sound of her father's voice, tears already forming in her eyes. Her daughter, Marie, squeezed her hand reassuringly, a child offering strength to her parent in a moment of need. Marcus stepped out to greet Mr. Cooper, who had dressed up despite his protests, wearing a pressed shirt and his best slacks. Rex's collar had even been cleaned for the occasion. I've got a special table for us, Marcus said, leading them toward the private room. And a surprise. The moment Mr. Cooper stepped through the doorway, time seemed to stop. He saw Sarah J. first, his step faltering as recognition dawned on his face. Then his eyes moved to the children, understanding flooding his features as he took in Marie's familiar dimples and Tommy's stance that mirrored his own military bearing. Sarah? He whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah J. Daddy, she replied, the word coming out as both a sob and a laugh. She took a step forward, then another, until suddenly she was running the few steps between them, throwing her arms around her father like she was still the little girl from the photographs. Mr. Cooper's arms wrapped around his daughter automatically, his eyes closed tight against tears as he held her. Rex circled them excitedly, tail wagging as he sensed the emotional reunion. The children watched wide-eyed as their mother and grandfather held each other, 12 years of separation dissolving in a moment of pure love. I'm sorry, Sarah J. sobbed into her father's shoulder. I'm so sorry about everything. About leaving, about not coming back, about Mom. Her voice broke on the last word. No, sweetheart, Mr. Cooper said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm the one who's sorry. I should have found you. Your mother, she tried so hard. He pulled back slightly, looking at his daughter's face as if memorizing every detail. You look just like her. Little Marie stepped forward then, tugging gently on Sarah J's sleeve. Mommy, she said softly, is this Grandpa? Mr. Cooper's eyes filled with fresh tears as he knelt down to his granddaughter's level. Yes, sweetheart, he said softly. I'm your grandpa. He opened his arms, and after a quick glance at her mother for permission, Marie stepped into them. Tommy followed, less certain but equally curious about this grandfather he'd never known. Marcus quietly backed away from the scene, moving to the kitchen to give the family privacy. Through the window in the door, he could see them settling at the table he prepared, Mr. Cooper already reaching for photos in his wallet as the children leaned in eagerly to see. What had started with a simple act of kindness at a grocery store had led to this moment, a family torn apart by pride and circumstance, finally finding their way back to each other. 1 year later, on a crisp Thanksgiving morning, the aroma of roasting turkey and fresh-baked pies filled the Cooper household. The once quiet home now buzzed with life and laughter. Mr. Cooper stood in his kitchen, wearing Sarah's old apron and supervising a parade of helping hands preparing the holiday feast. The past year had brought changes that even Marcus couldn't have predicted. Sarah J. and her children had moved back to town, renting a small house just 3 streets away from her father. She had transformed the garage, once filled with boxes of memories, into an art studio where she worked on commissions for local businesses. Her latest project, a new sign for Sweet Home Cooking, hung proudly over Marcus's restaurant. Tommy and Marie had enrolled in the same school where their grandmother had once taught, and Mr. Cooper found himself walking them home most afternoons, just as he and Sarah had done with Sarah J. so many years ago. The kids had grown especially close to Rex, who despite his advanced age had found new energy in playing with his young companions. Dad, the rolls are burning, Sarah J. called out, rushing to rescue the golden brown dinner rolls from the oven. Her father laughed, a sound that had become wonderfully common in the house. On the kitchen counter, next to recipe cards in Sarah's handwriting, sat new ones written by Sarah J., continuing the family's culinary traditions. Marcus arrived just before noon, carrying additional chairs from his restaurant. Over the past year, he had become more than just a friend, he was family. Every Wednesday, without fail, he still brought dinner and stayed to share stories. But now the quiet conversations of the past have been replaced by lively family discussions and the happy chaos of children's laughter. Uncle Marcus, Marie called out, running to help him with the chairs. She had taken to calling him that shortly after the reunion, and the name had stuck. Tommy followed close behind, eager to show Marcus his latest report card. All A's, just like his mother's had been. The dining room table, once set for one, now barely contained all the place settings needed. Photos lined the walls, old ones showing Sarah and Mr. Cooper in their younger days mixed with new ones capturing recent memories. Birthday celebrations, school events, and quiet family moments that might have seemed ordinary to others but meant everything to them. As they gathered around the table, Mr. Cooper looked at the faces of his expanded family. Sarah J. sat to his right, her eyes bright with happiness, so like her mother's that sometimes it took his breath away. The children occupied the chairs where Sarah's third-grade students had once sat for Sunday dinners, and Marcus filled the spot that had somehow always been waiting for him. Rex lay contentedly under the table, his head resting on Mr. Cooper's foot, accepting occasional treats from Tommy and Marie. The old dog had gained back some of the weight he'd lost during Sarah's illness, his coat chinier and his step lighter since the family had been reunited. Before they began eating, Mr. Cooper stood, his voice steady as he spoke. "A year ago, I thought I had lost everything," he said, looking around the table. "I was counting coins at a grocery store, too proud to admit how lost I was without your mother." He paused, meeting Marcus's eyes. "But sometimes help comes from unexpected places, and family can be found in unexpected people." Sarah J. reached for her father's hand, tears shining in her eyes. "Mom would have loved this," she said softly. "She always said there was room for more love at our table." Marcus smiled, remembering the lonely veteran he'd met that day at Morton's grocery store. The military bearing was still there, but now it was softened by joy. The house that had once echoed with silence now rang with the sounds of life and healing. As they passed dishes around the table, sharing food and stories, Marcus thought about how a simple act of kindness had rippled outward, touching so many lives. The grocery bill he'd paid that day had purchased more than just food. It had bought a chance for a family to heal, for a father and daughter to find their way back to each other, and for love to fill the empty spaces grief had left behind. Mr. Cooper caught his eye and nodded, both men understanding without words how far they'd come. In the warm light of that Thanksgiving afternoon, surrounded by the family they'd pieced back together, they were reminded that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as everyday moments of compassion.